so this video is going to be a little different than the other NES game reviews in this series. I'll be giving some thoughts I have about Ice Climber, Donkey Kong Jr., Mario Bros, and Balloon Fight. I grouped these 5 games into one video because there's just not enough going on to warrant independent videos, and they share quite a lot of characteristics. The first section of the video is talking about NES arcade ports as a whole, while the second half will be my opinion on the 5 different games specifically. If this is the first video of this series that you're watching, the basic concept is that I'm reviewing the NES classic games from the perspective of someone that has pretty much no nostalgia for them. Episode 1 of this series was on Excitebike, and you should check it out if you'd like this one. Now that I'm done explaining all that, let's get into it. By the time the NES had come out in 1985, Nintendo had already been quite successful in the world of arcade machines, so it only made sense for them to port a bunch of arcade original games to the NES to bolster its early game library. I want to preface a lot of my criticisms by saying that I do not dislike arcade games specifically, and there's tons of arcade originals that I love dearly. 2 of my favorite arcade games, Pac-Man and Galaga, were released well before the NES's debut in '85, so this isn't a matter of me disliking early '80s era arcade games. That being said, all 5 of these games didn't ever grab me in the way that Pac-Man and Galaga did. I made sure I wasn't just leaning on childhood memories of enjoying Pac-Man and Galaga by replaying both before writing this script, and I can confirm that they were much more engaging than any of the 5 games in this review. After losing in either Pac-Man or Galaga, I wanted to immediately start up another round and see if I could get a higher score or progress further through the levels. There was always a small voice in my head telling myself that if I had just reacted slightly quicker, I would have avoided getting my ship hit. Losing in any of these 5 NES arcade ports just ended up with me considering if I wanted to keep trying to squeeze some enjoyment out of them, or just give up and move on to the next game. I do think it's important to note that I played the arcade ports of Galaga and Pac-Man, because I wanted to save playing the NES ports for the first time once I had gotten to them as part of this series. The biggest issue that permeates all 5 arcade ports is that they're just so damn slow. I would give the games a little more slack if they were that slow because of technical limitations, but again, Pac-Man and Galaga had no problem delivering quick, reflex-based gameplay systems in the very same era. Just to cover my bases here, I'm not saying that every game has to be about twitch reflexes. One quick look at my hours played in Civ 5 or other turn-based games proves that I can enjoy titles with slower pacing if they involve some thinking or strategy to keep my attention. There are plenty of other games that are relatively slow and don't require too much deep thought or problem solving, they just make up for it in their narrative, visuals, audio, or atmosphere. Unfortunately, there just isn't enough going on in any of these aspects for me to really dig into these 5 NES arcade ports. With all honesty, I would never have played these for long at all if it weren't for the fact that I said that I would review all 30 games on the NES Classic. I was close to skipping these because I figured none of them would have enough going on to warrant a video, but I realized that I had a lot to say about this style of game as a whole and why I don't personally find them appealing. Like I said in my last video, I understand that some of these games might have been pretty cutting edge for the time that they were released, but from my perspective as part of this series, the technological and cultural importance of these games isn't nearly as important as how the games themselves hold up after all these years. Donkey Kong isn't automatically a good game just because it is the first appearance of the most recognized character in all of gaming history. I also think that later games in the Mario franchise, being very good, have retroactively improved how a lot of people view Donkey Kong and the original Mario Bros. I don't really think the same effect has happened on Ice Climber or Balloon Fight, as those are not franchises with nearly the same influence as Mario. Now that you understand my thoughts about all of these games as a whole, I'm going to get into the different positive and negative aspects of each game individually, and then end with the final verdict of all 5 games. First off is Ice Climber. Ice Climber is the first of this batch of games that I played. It's what convinced me that there is no way I would be able to squeeze an entire video of discussion out of a game that small, especially if I wasn't going to be very positive. In general, I find that I have much more that I want to say about games that I love, or even games that missed their mark despite having some good potential. When I just hate something, sometimes I have a ton to say about why I think it sucks, but sometimes I don't have much more to say than, of course it sucks, spend 1 second playing it and you'll understand. Ice Climber made me realize that I'd need to understand at least a little bit of what it is about a game that makes me dislike it, especially considering this is a game that at least some people out there have a fond nostalgia for. The first thing that was obvious about Ice Climber was that I hated the physics of the platforming. Pushing buttons on the controller feels like you're just making a suggestion. Sometimes the game listens, sometimes it doesn't, it just depends on how it feels. I know it's a little unfair to compare Ice Climber to Super Mario Bros. Because it was released a few years earlier, but it's pretty insane to see how much Nintendo improved platforming mechanics in the time between the two releases. The glacial speed that you run at makes the game feel like a slow crawl, and it seems like not nearly enough horizontal momentum is carried from the running speed to the mid-air jump speed. I've got two more gripes. Once you've played Ice Climber for about 60 seconds, you've heard every bit of music in the game. I'm not sure if this was a hardware limitation or what, but only having two 30-second tracks to loop makes the music get old real quick. Also, who in the name of God decided that you can't jump up through the bottom of a cloud platform? I'm not sure if I'm insane, but it seems like that would make sense, and it would definitely make some of the levels a bit more forgiving. To end on a positive note, I do like that you can choose which level to continue at from the start menu, so you aren't expected to start from the very beginning each time. Now moving on from Ice Climber, we have Donkey Kong. This actually isn't my first time playing this game. When I got the NES Classic a few years ago, I played a bit of Donkey Kong because I wanted to get a tiny sample of the very first game featuring Mario. I remember thinking it was alright at the time, and honestly my thoughts haven't changed much since then. Although it certainly feels a little better to control than Ice Climber, it's still a slow-paced game. Even though Donkey Kong came out before it was a pretty standard mechanic, having fall damage in a platformer still drives me up the wall. It isn't necessarily a bad mechanic, and I understand that implementing gravity was probably beyond their capabilities at the time. I'm just happy they didn't include fall damage in Super Mario Bros. One last personal nitpick is that I can't stand the little squeaking running sound effect. It sounds like my friend Dave is skipping down the aisles of a freshly waxed IKEA in his New Balances. When I write scripts for these videos, I sometimes play the audio for my gameplay recordings as background noise, but I sure as hell didn't do that for Donkey Kong. Overall, I somewhat enjoyed my time with Donkey Kong, but I finished it in about 4 minutes, which is horribly quick, even for an early NES game. There just isn't that much gameplay to sink your teeth into here. Next up is the heir to the Royal Kong bloodline, Donkey Kong Jr., which I enjoyed much less than the first one. It continues the tradition of being slow as hell, but I do think it's clever that you can increase the speed that you move vertically by holding on to 2 vines instead of just 1, with the trade-off being that you've got twice as much of a chance to have to move out of the way and avoid the animals moving up and down. Once again, the fall damage is infuriating because DK Jr. seems to be unable to survive a 6-inch drop. Finally, the second level was just annoying enough to make me skip on to the next game. I know that I have the skill to eventually learn how to beat the second stage, I just don't have the patience to spend the time doing it. Before moving on to the next game, the final note I took on DK Jr. was this. Life is just too short to waste it playing this stupid f***ing second level. Up next is the first ever Mario Bros. Game, but this one plays very differently than any subsequent games in the series. I'm sure this isn't a unique problem, but I kept trying to jump on the back of enemies because it was just ingrained in my Mario muscle memory. While the first 3 games I've discussed all suffered from being too slow, I don't really think that Mario Bros. Has the same issue. I think that can also be attributed a bit to the fact that there seems to be a greater amount of horizontal momentum carried over to Mario when you jump. I know I keep bringing up horizontal momentum, and at this point it's probably tedious to hear about it so much, but it really does make a huge difference. The reality is that platformers live and die based on how the characters feel to move, and Mario Bros. Is a huge improvement in the way Mario moves over Donkey Kong. Obviously, Nintendo would continue to improve this and deliver even better movement physics for Super Mario Bros., but I'd say the original Mario Bros. Got the devs halfway there in terms of developing the baseline physics system that every single platformer would inevitably be compared to. The arcade gameplay of Mario Bros. Is pretty fun, but it's quite repetitive and the stages and enemies don't have enough variety to make any parts of this game feel that different. At this point in my review process, Mario Bros. Was my favorite of the 4 NES arcade ports I had played so far, but interestingly enough, my favorite of the bunch ended up being the last one I covered for this video. Much like Donkey Kong and Mario Bros., this was not the first time I had ever played Balloon Fight. It was another of the handful of games that I messed around with after getting the NES Classic. The gameplay of Balloon Fight is very similar to Joust, which is to say that it isn't exactly a straightforward platformer. This game has a very interesting movement system, and I enjoy the balance between horizontal speed and vertical speed. Pumping your wings in order to travel quickly horizontally makes you move up as well. Your objective is to eliminate all of the enemies on the screen by popping the balloons that keep them afloat and then either destroying the parachutes that deploy when they fall down, or running into them as they try to inflate up another balloon. The clouds on the screen will also periodically shoot out a ball of lightning that bounces around the screen, adding another obstacle to avoid. These mechanics all combine to make the player scramble to knock out any downed enemy before they recover, while also trying to not lose one of their own balloons in the process. On top of the standard game mode of Balloon Fight, there is a second mode called Balloon Trip, which is actually my favorite part of the game. It's sort of a proto-endless runner that came out way before the games that codified the endless runner genre, like Cannabalt or Jetpack Joyride. This mode taps into the same kind of feeling that Galaga or Pac-Man does, and again I'm talking about the constant thought that I can get just a little further next round with the knowledge I've accumulated from past attempts. The same kind of motivation to get a little bit further is also what makes fighting bosses in Dark Souls so fun. Go ahead and mark the obligatory Dark Souls comparison space on your Bonfire Games bingo card. Reviewing these games devoid of historical and technological context feels sorta like bullying them. My gut reaction was to take it easy on these games because of just how early they were released, but the entire point of this series is to review games ignoring nostalgia. I had the thought that a good way to judge these games is to pretend they're new indie releases from small dev teams. Giving too much slack for these games somewhat blocks my ultimate goal: understanding these games exactly as they are, not as they were. Final verdict: don't play these games, but if you have to pick one, pick Balloon Fight. If you've gotten this far, thank you for watching. I really do love making these, but I also appreciate that anyone at all cares what I think enough to watch this. Now that we're done with the earliest NES releases, we're starting to get into the heavy hitters. The next review is Super Mario Bros., one of the most influential games ever made. See you next time.